Hello everybody, I want to talk to you about the institutions, the primary institutions that are designed to deal with human behavior. Think in terms of our default setting as humans, sin and ignorance. That's our default setting, and that's what the institutions are designed to deal with. We are born sinners, we'll talk more about that, and we're born without knowledge. And so as we go through life, we are supposed to be acquiring and gaining more knowledge. So if that's the nature of humanity, then it takes institutions that God has developed to deal with that. And the primary institution is family. The idea is obviously the family's responsibility is to raise responsible people, to make sure that they're moral, they're ethical, they're of high character, that they obviously become productive members of society that are not only self-interested but are interested in others, that help others. But you think in terms of human nature, we are devoted to self-interest. You think of it, if you have your own kids, if you have younger siblings, nieces, nephews, whatever, and you watch these kids, they're being raised, the default setting is fierce devotion to self-interest. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I need a diaper change, I want to be picked up, I want to be rocked, whatever the case is. And as they get older, it's the kind of same thing. And you see a manifestation of that self-interest in terms of what are the means that these kids are willing to use to get what they want. They will lie, cheat, steal. They will refuse to share. And here's the thing. Do you need to teach kids how to lie, cheat, steal, refuse to share? No, it's just a default setting. They just do it on their own. It's kind of comical in some cases where, even here's where the sin and the ignorance come in, where one of the parents tells the kid, you can't have a cookie right now. Well, the kid, sneaks a cookie and he's got chocolate all over his face. And then, mom or dad ask, hey, did you have a cookie? No. Okay, so you're a liar. You got what you wanted after I told you not to do it, and you got chocolate over your face, so you don't even realize the implications of the evidence that's sitting on your, right there on your face. So that's what we're dealing with. So family, think in terms of, the nature of family. If it's done right, you've got dad and mom together raising the kids. So you have that 2 to however many children they have, only child 2-to-1 ratio of focus of attention on that kid. And Thomas Sowell, in his book, Discriminations and Disparities, he talks about how even in a single family unit, you can have differences in outcomes based on the ratio of attention. The idea being is that if it's, the firstborn typically is going to be, by default, have the most attention because their attention is not divided with the other kids. And he makes a point that once you get to 5 or more kids, that focus of attention is so divided and so diminished that there are implications on down the road for those younger siblings. And so he even does some stats in terms of CEOs and presidents of companies and members of Congress and people in high elected positions typically are the firstborn, and he attributes that in part to the ratio of attention, both parents to that kid at first, and then of course it gets split apart as you have more kids. But the idea is that you still have a better ratio of attention when it comes to 2 parents and however many kids they have, as opposed to the church or schools. And I think the kind of default setting for school is 1 teacher to about 35 students, depending on where you go, and if you can afford private school and have smaller ratios. But the idea is that the focus of attention is very, very important. And also, with dad and mom in the home, you have a balance of emotions and strategies to deal with the kid and the kid's needs. Sometimes they need that loving affection and that hug and reassurance of a mother. Sometimes they need that stern warning and motivation, if you will, of the father. It's a balance. And so if both of those elements are there in balance and done right, then we can anticipate that the kid is going to have a much higher chance of growing up to be moral, ethical, responsible, and all that. So we think in terms of, what is the content that comes from what the parents bring? And you can see here, morals, values, skills, work ethic, discipline, and perseverance. Delayed gratification, one of the biggest ones. Well, I want, dealing with that default setting of devotion to self-interest. Well, that self-interest may hurt you if unless you kind of delay that, and you may want that Twinkie right now, but you're not going to like it later on when you keep eating Twinkies and you don't like the health implications of that. So those implications of behavior, short-term, mid-term, long-term, and eternal. The parents have to be there. Hey, look, I know what you're struggling with. I know what you're going through. I know what you're contemplating. Here are the short-term implications of what you're talking about. Here are the mid-term, long-term, and eternal implications of what you're contemplating here. So let me walk you through that. I have the knowledge that you don't. I've been here on this earth longer, and I was taught, hopefully, correctly. I'm going to pass it on to you because you're missing content. So let me give that to you, and let me have that discussion with you, and let me hear your frustrations and your struggles and your emotional stuff that comes along with that in terms of having a hard time dealing with this. Let me encourage you. Let me tell you, hey, look, if you just delay this, you'll be happier later. So put it off. Have the discipline now to study. Have the discipline now to exercise. Have the discipline now to avoid stupidity, and you'll be happy later on. And of course, there needs to be certain accountability. Now, if you stray from my advice, or my commands, or my orders to you, or my directives to you, well, guess what? There's going to be some implications for that. And if the family's doing their job right, particularly biblically rooted, they're going to be teaching Scripture in terms of, hey, look, here's what God says about the subject. So think of it in terms of also Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have our lowest order needs, which, in order to live, I need air, I need food. I need to make sure that I'm not going to die. So I need basic human needs. I need, sufficient resources to make sure I have that food, shelter, clothing, a place to stay where, the house is not going to, fall down on me, where the doors have locks, where I'm in a neighborhood where I don't think I'm going to get shot. I need to make sure that I'm safe. And kids are going to be, have these needs, obviously, but the parents are taking care of these. So once the parents take care of the physiological needs, the safety needs, then they can start getting into the social needs in terms of teaching them practical lessons and skill sets and things like that. If I'm starving to death or if I'm suffocating, I don't care what house I live in. I don't care what grades I get. I need to live. So the idea is that once the lower order need is met, it no longer motivates human behavior. But if that lower order need is not met, you're never going to get to the higher levels. And this is what we see when we have communities that are substantially disadvantaged, you have high crime and all that. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the failures of the institutions. But if you're constantly focused in this realm, you're never going to be able to have academic achievement. You're never going to develop skill sets. You're never going to get into those realms where you're actually a useful member of society. And when you're constantly down here, you're going to have character problems as well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So the idea is for the family, that focus and attention. I'm going to meet these needs. I'm going to make sure that you're taught correctly and you have the skill sets. I'm going to make sure that as you develop this, you're useful to others. And I like to frame that esteem thing as, okay, I've actually developed a skill set that other people respect. Not that I'm trying to impress anybody. It's like, well, I'm self-sufficient and good for what I need, but I can also help you. And of course, ultimately, when I've done all this stuff and I've been raised to do this and I'm equipped to do this, I can actually live my purpose, my God-given purpose, and why I'm here in the first place. CBU's motto of live your purpose. That's what we're supposed to be able to achieve through primarily the family. So think about that we need to have all these things met primarily there. If the family does its job right, then the church also has a place too. And that is if people are going to a biblically grounded, properly teaching, Bible teaching church, then talking about salvation and wisdom and purpose and faith, and again, kind of borrowing from the family as well, implications of behavior, responsibility to self, responsibility to God, responsibility to others. And so that builds upon the family. And school, whether it's homeschool or public school, and we'll talk about the failures of this institution publicly especially, but if it's done right, the school is teaching knowledge related to marketable skills. How can I help you to live your purpose? By tapping into what your skill sets are, what you're interested in, with obviously baseline knowledge that you need to carry into that. And we'll talk about the failures that schools today have a very big problem with, not only in terms of not meeting basic skill sets, but actually either working against them or lowering standards and all that. We'll talk about that. But if school does their job right, guess what? These kids, as they're being raised, are going to have the information, the knowledge, the skills, abilities that they need to be successful members of society, to have a marketable skill set. The idea is that if you're a deadbeat and you're ignorant and you know nothing, what do you have to trade in the marketplace? Nothing. So if your only skill set is to flip burgers, well, guess what? You're going to take in pay commensurate with that skill set. I'm not going to pay you $100 an hour to give me a hamburger. It's just dumb. So skills commensurate with what the public's willing to pay for it. That's why we need to make sure that we're doing this correctly. So very important that each institution does its job. And again, we'll talk about the implications of it if the institutions fail, or if people subject to the institutions refuse to cooperate and go along with it. And that's where we kind of come into the character aspect of things. The idea is that the family and the church is doing its job right. And of course, there's partly a school socialization aspect of this. But the idea is that if we're born here, then it's going to take these institutions to push us up here, and ultimately Christ himself taking us here. And of course, the Apostle Paul talks about his struggles with that in terms of, human nature, the struggle of human nature on this planet, where he said, I do the things that I don't want to do. I don't do the things that I should do. Who will save me from this wretched man that I am, this terrible place that I'm in? Oh, that's right, but God. Christ gives me the ability to, in spite of human nature, in spite of that the flesh constantly pulling me away from God, and the devil trying to pull me away from God's will and to destroy my life, God is still there for me. So in spite of my human nature, God can allow me to operate here. But if I'm going to have the right character, it's going to take these institutions to push me in that direction, because if I'm left to myself, typically it's going to be down here. And there's all kinds of reasons in society and social norms that are pushing people down here. And Scripture talks about that, and I'll post scriptures on Blackboard that you need to review in terms of people becoming lovers of themselves, haters of God, backbiters, insolent, disrespectful to parents, all that kind of stuff. So, the falling apart of those responsibilities and the institutions that we'll talk about in the next video. But character is crucial, because the idea is that when the primary institutions fail, or people don't cooperate with them, that's when government steps in. And we'll talk about the limitations that when government steps in, you don't have that small ratio. You don't have the resources that are contained within that family unit to fully devote to your own family unit, to your own kids. They're massively spread out, massively understaffed, massively underfunded in most cases. And the reaction that you're going to get from them is going to be very fragmented and limited. And sometimes it's kind of the hammer and the fly type of thing, where it's like, well, you really didn't need a hammer to solve that problem, but because you have such limitations, that there's a tendency to try and do that. But in any case, if needs are met, so what I'm dealing with and who I'm dealing with, what I'm dealing with are the circumstances, hopefully that we'll talk about failing circumstances and failing environments. But who am I dealing with? Am I dealing with somebody at the low end here when it comes to interaction with the government, or am I dealing with someone up here? And we'll talk more about that as we get into, say, probation reports. And before people get sentenced, it's like, okay, let's do a probation report, find out, well, who are we dealing with? Are we dealing with somebody that has the capacity to be rehabilitated or not? And we'll talk about those implications. So this first video is simply to share with you what we're dealing with in terms of human nature, the primary institutions that are designed to deal with that, to prepare people to be successful in life and society, to be self-sufficient, to be able to help others, and to remove incentives to commit crime from a practical standpoint, referring back to Maslow, and remove incentives to commit crime from a character standpoint, getting people up here so they're not even thinking about that. So let me know if you have any questions about this. The next video, again, we're going to talk about the failures of the institutions or the failure to cooperate with them, and we will go from there. And of course, this week's assignments will correlate to these institutions. Let me know if you have any questions or if I can help you in any way. Thank you.